There are things that happen in the 1840s and 1850s that really bring the slavery issue to the surface in a way that cannot be settled through peaceful means. They end up fighting a war over it, basically, right? Initiated by the South. Remember that. The South secedes, the South shoots first. The annexation of Texas, the Texas Revolt and the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, which is referred to in the book as the Mexican War, although I remember, I think in high school it was the Mexican-American War, but he refers to it as the Mexican War. And also the Dred Scott case in 1857. So Texas is a part of Mexico, right? I showed you that map of Mexico. There are Americans who are immigrating into Mexico, right? White Americans are crossing the border into Mexico and living there. They're immigrating there. And a lot of them are bringing slaves, which is illegal in Mexico. So there are people from America who are immigrating to Mexico, undocumented, and are guilty of human trafficking. It's kind of, Well, another interesting thing is also that there's basically an issue with Mexico where the United States ends up taking 1/3 of their country, right? So think about that. You think about that too when there's an issue where there's a border crisis, where the security of the United States is being threatened by a border crisis. We've never given up terror. So when there's people at the border and we're being invaded, like they use language like that. I mean, we've never actually had to cede land or give up land to Mexico. They've lost land to us, and this is an example. So Texas, after a while, there sort of is a concern about the number of people who are coming in and the amount of land they're purchasing, and also the fact that they are bringing slaves in to work that land, which is illegal. Slavery is abolished in Mexico in 1829, right? And this is not another state. This isn't like the Fugitive Slave Clause where other states have to honor the fact that you own slaves, and so if a slave runs away, a free state has to, sort of help you catch them or something. This is a completely different country, right? So you can't, so these people are going into a completely different country and basically breaking their laws by owning slaves. It leads to basically this group of Americans in Texas creating an independent Texas, independent of Mexico, but not a state in the United States yet. So from 1836 to 1845, Texas is actually the Lone Star Republic. It's actually its own sort of independent country, to a certain, and then in 1845 it's annexed by the United States. Today the border with Texas and Mexico, a lot of it is the Rio Grande, the river. That was not the original border. It was further north than that, right? But the United States government, a year after that, the Mexican-American War starts, where the United States then proceeds to try to take even more of Mexico. They want to extend the border of Texas further south to the Rio Grande. They also want, this idea of manifest destiny. In 1845, that's where this term is first coined, term manifest destiny, that America is destined to, go from coast to coast and occupy this whole swath of territory, right? There's a desire to expand the borders, of the United States just generally. So there's basically a situation where the border of Texas, the United States wants it to go further south to the Rio Grande. That's not the recognized border by Mexican government, right? So the United States just sends the army, an army under General Zachary Taylor, who becomes president later on, across this basically has them march into Mexico towards the Rio Grande, where they want the border to be, knowing that they'll be shot at. They'll create a conflict. That's basically how the war starts. There's a declaration of war started because of that, where it's like this government over here says this is the line where their country starts. We're just going to walk over into it, knowing that they're going to defend themselves, and then it's going to start a war basically. And that's how it starts. Mexican-American War. Eventually, an army under Winfield Scott, General Winfield Scott, lands at Veracruz. You know where Veracruz is? It's on the eastern coast of Mexico. And marches and moves through the interior of Mexico and wins a series of battles, and then occupies Mexico City. There's actually a battle to defend Mexico City. This is something that a lot of Americans don't know about. It's in Mexico City and Mexico, this is a very there's a lot of history around this conflict because their capital is occupied by the United States. By 1848, a treaty is signed ending this war, right? So, there's a treaty to end the war where both sides agree to certain terms. And Mexico agrees to cede, to give up to the United States, present day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, part of Wyoming. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I don't know why I'm putting an L in front of that D. Hidalgo. It's Hidalgo. Yeah. Hidalgo. Sorry. I'm Norte Americano. No sé. And so there's a treaty. There's a treaty. There are diplomats from America that they're negotiating this treaty, and they're paid. They're compensated $15 million, which is that's how much the Louisiana Purchase was 50 years earlier. But that was land that the French, Louisiana territory, the French offered to sell it to the United States, right? This is land where basically, they agree to a treaty and they're compensated somewhat, but you just march. I mean, if you at the time in the 1840s, Mexico, the government was not a very unified government. There was a lot of fragmentation. They were not a very powerful. They were not as powerful as the United States at the time, right? Their military wasn't as powerful. So you're taking a situation where one side is not where you have a clear advantage, right? Where you can just march you may be able to march an army in and win militarily and force this country to agree to your terms in this treaty. That doesn't necessarily make it the right thing to do, This is the sort of thing where the UN you'd hear about the United Nations like condemning this or passing a resolution against this, and it may not stop what the United States, it might, something like that doesn't necessarily today stop what a country's doing. But it creates it allows for the people around the world to sort of see that there's this moral or ethical judgment against a country for illegal invading. If you invade a country without provocation, if you're not attacked, if it's not into self-defense, you have to show really good reasons why you're invading, right? And this one was basically just they wanted land that wasn't theirs, and so they went in and took it. That's basically, and that's really what happened, right? So. And so this is, like I've mentioned this before, this is a great example of where, when we talk about immigration, this is an example where the border of the United States moves south. People don't move north from Latin America. People don't move from Mexico because they want to come to America. They're living in Mexico, but then all of a sudden, where they're living is no longer Mexico and it's the United States, right? If you live in California in 1830, by 1850, you're in the United States. It's not Mexico anymore, right? So you didn't move anywhere. There is a compromise over slavery reached where it's called the Compromise of 1850. So there's the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and then this is a similar compromise of 1850, where California becomes a state and it becomes a free state in 1850. There were about 300 slaves that had already been brought into California before it became a state. Right? Texas had become a state prior to the war, and that's a southern state where slavery is. So California gets to enter as a free state, right? But there's also a more robust fugitive slave act which is passed, right? The fugitive slave laws are basically saying that if a slave runs away and makes it to a state where slavery is illegal, that free state still has to return the slave. They have to capture them and return them. And this is and at first in the Constitution, it's basically you need to honor this agreement and you need to try and apprehend these people for us, or you need to let us come into your state and with our slave catchers and look for them. But this is really a more explicit law where there are actually like federal agents and slave catchers that are coming into northern states, are forcing, trying to get local government, state government to use their resources to apprehend runaway slaves. Who's familiar with the term sanctuary city? Sanctuary city, right? So you know how there's this issue where the federal government, the current federal government wants to, there's this push sort of to deport a lot of people, mass deportation, who are here undocumented, right? Who aren't legal residents for whatever reason. And then there are these cities like San Francisco and other places that are called sanctuary cities where undocumented immigrants are not necessarily criminal. It's not criminalized, the fact that they're here undocumented. And so there's a push and pull between what the federal government wants and what like California wants to do with undocumented immigrants as far as treatment. Similar to this, right, where there's a situation where now the federal government is attempting to enforce slavery and catch runaway slaves and uphold that institution for southern states, but at the expense of northern states, right? Northerners are now being compelled to actually actively support the institution of slavery by rounding up fugitive runaway slaves. And that's an important thing to think about when you think of states' rights. People who talk about when these southern states refer to states' rights and the rights of states, and we have the right to own slaves, and slavery should be decided by the states. But these southern states themselves are actually using the federal government to force free states to do things that they don't want, right? So they're infringing on the rights, really, because you think about if a state makes slavery illegal, so if someone who's a slave in a southern state flees and makes it into the state where they've made slavery illegal, and the fugitive slave issue is the main reason that states are going to secede, southern states, and form the Confederacy and fight the Civil War. They're going to cite the lack of support of capturing their property and returning their property. They're going to cite this as a reason for leaving the Union.